Materials, being the heart of the teaching and learning process, should not be random recreations or simply crafty clones of previous successful materials. Instead, it must be coherent and grounded on the application of theories of language acquisition.
Language learning and acquisition theories are a result of years of reflective teaching and observational research. If we will combine these theories available to us, we will surely formulate criteria which would contribute to the development of successful materials.
That is why Brian Tomlinson suggested 6 principles of language acquisition that could provide a menu of potentially profitable options for material developers. The first one on the list is that a prerequisite for language acquisition is that learners are exposed to rich, meaningful, and comprehensible input of the language. In order to acquire the ability to use language effectively, the learners need a lot of experiences of language, being used in a variety of different ways for a variety of purposes. According to Stephen Pabraquel, students need enough and meaningful input to gain positive access of language. Students also need to experience particular language items and features many times in meaningful and comprehensible input in order to eventually acquire them.
The second principle of language acquisition. The second principle of language acquisition says that in order for the learners to maximize their language in use, they need to be engaged both affectively and cognitively in the language experience. If the learners do not think and feel whilst experiencing language, they are unlikely to acquire any elements of it. Thinking whilst experiencing language use helps to achieve the deep processing required for effective and durable learning.
Feeling enjoyment, pleasure, happiness, empathy, being amused, being excited, and being stimulated are most likely to influence acquisition positively. But feeling annoyance, anger, fear, opposition, and sadness is more useful than feeling nothing at all. Ideally, the learner should be experiencing positive affect in the sense of being confident, motivated, and willingly engaged even when experiencing negative emotions.
The third principle of language learning, language learners who achieve positive affect are much more likely to achieve communicative competence than those who do not. Language learners need to be positive about the target language, their learning environment, their teachers, their fellow learners, and their learning materials. They also need to achieve positive self-esteem and to feel that they are achieving something worthwhile. Above all, they need to be emotionally involved in the learning process and to respond by laughing, getting angry, feeling sympathy, feeling happy, feeling sad, and etc. Positive emotions seem to be the most useful in relation to language acquisition, but it is much better to feel angry than to feel nothing at all.
Under the third principle of language acquisition, there are principles of materials development. Number 1. Make sure the text and task are interesting, relevant, and enjoyable as possible so as to exert a positive influence on the learner's attitudes to the language and to the process of learning it. Number 2. Set achievable challenges which help to raise the learner's self-esteem when success is accomplished. And the third, stimulate emotive responses through the use of music, song, literature, art, and etc. through making use of controversial and provocative text, through personalization, and through inviting learners to articulate their feelings about a text before asking them to analyze it.
An example of these learning materials, for instance, I offer the students choices of text for their tasks and I consult the students about the topics that they would like to read and to discuss inside the classroom.
Fourth, second language learners can benefit from using those mental resources which they typically use in a first language acquisition.
A considerable amount of literature revealed that the use of mental images, inner speech, emotional response, and personal interpretation are typically used in the first language acquisition. Literature demonstrates that we can use the knowledge of first language and the strategies such as inner voice and visual images in improving the learning of second language.
The fifth principle of language acquisition. The fifth principle of language acquisition says that language learners can benefit from noticing salient features of the input. If learners notice for themselves how a particular language item or feature is used, they are more likely to develop their language awareness. They are also more likely to achieve readiness for acquisition.
Such noticing is most salient when a learner has been engaged in a text cognitively and effectively and then returns it to investigate its language use. This is likely to lead to the learners paying more attention to the similar uses of that item or feature in the next inputs.
The sixth principle in language acquisition, learners need opportunities to use language to try to achieve communicative purposes. When using language in this way, they are gaining feedback on the hypotheses they have developed as a result of generalizing on the language in their intake and on their ability to make use of them effectively. If they are participating in interaction, they are also being pushed to clarify and elaborate, and they are also likely to elicit meaningful and comprehensible input from their interlocutors.
Under the sixth principle of language acquisition, there are principles of materials development. Number 1. Provide many opportunities for the learners to produce language in order to achieve intended outcomes. Number 2. Make sure that these output activities are designed so that the learners are using language rather than just practicing specified features of it. Number 3. Design output activities so that they help learners to develop their ability to communicate fluently, accurately, appropriately, and effectively. Number 4. Make sure that the output activities are fully contextualized, in that the learners are responding to an authentic stimulus, that they have specific addresses, and that they have a clear intended outcome in mind. For example, a text, need, viewpoint, or an event. And number 5, try to ensure that opportunities for feedback are built into output activities and are provided for the learners afterwards.
An example of this material, for instance, I develop a material in which the students have to produce a text which is a development from one they have just experienced. For example, they have to design an improvised version of a vehicle from a newspaper advertisement and then perform a TV advertisement for their improvised version of the vehicle.
Marrying the language principles to material development, Mr. Brian Tomlinson now suggested the basic principles of second language acquisition relevant to the development of materials for teaching of language. Materials should achieve impact. Impact is achieved when when materials have a noticeable effect on learners. That is when learners' curiosity, interest, and attention are attracted. If it is achieved, there is a better chance that some of the language in the materials will be taken for the processing.
Relating this principle to language acquisition, we may say that through impact, we can induce the feeling of amusement and the feeling of excitement to our learner, which could possibly affect the acquisition of language. Learners will only learn if they need and want to learn, and if they are willing to invest time and energy in the process. Thus, impact is needed to awaken students' enthusiasm.
But how can materials achieve impact?
First is through novelty. You can introduce unusual topics, illustrations, and activities. Next is through variety. You can break routines with an unexpected activity and use different text types taken from various sources. Third is through the use of attractive presentations. Examples are the use of attractive colors, a lot of white spaces in photographs. You can also use appealing content, examples of which are interesting topics, engaging stories, universal themes, and local references. Fifth is through achievable challenges, which will allow learners to think. It is also important to note that to achieve impact, language input must be contextualized. What achieves impact in the US class may not achieve impact in the typical Filipino class. So, you should always remember that the contextualized examples do not contain enough information, value, and impact to students.
Should help learners feel at ease. Although it is known that pressure can stimulate some types of language learners, most researchers agree that language learners benefit from feeling ease and that they lose opportunities for language learning when they are feeling anxious, uncomfortable, and tense.
Relating this principle to the theories of language acquisition, we can say that emotional involvement has an indispensable role in learning. Thus, affective engagement is essential for effective and durable learning of language. This principle is backed up by several studies. Research has shown the effects of various forms of anxiety on acquisition. The less anxious the learner, the better language acquisition proceeds. Similarly, relaxed and comfortable students apparently can learn more in shorter periods of time. Materials can help learners to feel at ease in a number of ways. Example, learners feel more comfortable with written materials with lots of white spaces than they do with materials in which lots of different activities are crammed together on the same page. Another example, learners are more at ease with texts and illustrations that they can relate to their own culture than they are with those which appear to them to be culturally alien. Also, learners are more relaxed with materials which are obviously trying to help them to learn than they are with materials which are always testing them.
Feeling at ease can also be achieved through a voice, which is relaxed and supportive, through content and activities which encourage personal participation of the learners, through materials which could relate to the world of book, to the world of the learner, through the absence of activities which could threaten self-esteem and cause humiliation. Materials should help learners develop self-confidence.
This principle is grounded on the idea that relaxed and self-confident learners learn faster. Having positive attitude towards the learning experience and developing self-esteem while learning are important determiners of successful learning.
Most material developers recognize the need to help learners develop self-confidence, but many of them attempt to do so through a process of simplification. They try to help learners feel successful by asking them to use simple language to accomplish easy tasks.
Examples of which are completing substitution tables, writing simple sentences, and filling in the blanks with dialogues. Although the approach of simplification is welcomed by teachers and students, Mr. Brian Tomlinson debunks this idea and suggests to build confidence through activities which try to push learners slightly beyond their existing proficiency by engaging them in tasks which are stimulating and problematic but achievable. It can also help if the activities encourage learners to use and to develop their existing extra-linguistic skills, such as those which involve being imaginative, being creative, or being analytical. An example on how this principle is applied: learners can often gain greater confidence from making up a story, writing a short poem, or making grammatical discovery than they can from getting right a simple drill.
What is being taught should be perceived by learners as relevant and useful. Most teachers recognize the need to make learners aware of the potential relevance and utility of the language skills they are teaching.
Relating this principle to the theories of language acquisition, we may say that the language input must be deemed by the students to be beneficial and relevant. This principle is grounded on various studies done by linguists. Stevick cites experiments which have shown the positive effect on learning and recall of items that are of personal significance to the learner. Similarly, Krashen and Wenden report research showed the importance of apparent relevance of utility on language acquisition. In general, English materials is obviously more difficult, but relevancy and usefulness of teaching points can be achieved by researching what the target learners are interested in and what they really want to learn the language for.
Perception of relevance and utility can also be achieved by relating teaching points to interesting and challenging classroom tasks, and by presenting them in many ways which could facilitate the achievement of the task out.
Obviously, providing the learners with a choice of topic and task is important if you are trying to achieve perception of relevance and utility in a general English textbook.
Materials should require and facilitate learners' self-investment.
Rutherford and Sharwood Smith assert that the role of classroom and of teaching materials is to aid the learner to make efficient use of the resources in order to facilitate self-discovery.
Learners profit most if they invest interest, effort, and attention in the learning activity. Materials can help them achieve this by providing them with the choices of focus and activity, by giving them topic control, and by engaging them in learner-centered discovery and activities.
One of the most profitable ways of doing this is to get learners interested in a written or spoken text, to get them to respond to it globally and effectively, and then to help them to analyze a particular linguistic feature of it in order to make discoveries for themselves. Other ways of achieving learner investment are involving the learners in mini projects, involving them in finding supplementary materials for particular units in a book, and giving them responsibility for making decisions about which text to use and how to use them.
Learners must be ready to acquire the points being taught.
This principle is based on the notion that certain structures of language are acquired only when learners are mentally ready for them. Studies like that of Heinemann claims that instruction can facilitate natural language acquisition processes if it coincides with the learner readiness, and can lead to increased speed and frequency of rule application and to application of rules in a wider range of linguistic contexts. Additionally, Heinemann also claimed that
premature instruction can be harmful because it can lead to the production of erroneous forms, to substitution by less complex forms, and to avoidance.
as argued by Krashen, There is a need for roughly tuned input, which is comprehensible because it features what the learners are already familiar with and also contain the potential for acquiring other elements of the input which each learner might or might not be ready to learn. Readiness can be achieved by materials which ensure that the learners have gained sufficient mastery over the developmental features of the previous stage before teaching a new one, and by materials which roughly tune the input so that it contains some features which are slightly above each learner's current state of proficiency. Perhaps the most important lesson for material developers from readiness research is that we cannot expect to select a particular point for teaching and assume that all learners are ready and willing to learn it. It is important to remember that the learner is always in charge, and that in the final analysis, we can never completely control what the learner does, for he selects and organizes the input.
Principle 7. Material should expose the learners to language in authentic use. Gratiot in 1985 claimed that comprehensible input in the target language is both necessary and sufficient for the acquisition of that language, provided that learners are effectively disposed to let in the input they comprehend. It is necessary that the learners need experience of how the language is typically used, but it is not sufficient, because they also need to notice how it is used and to use it for communicative purposes themselves. Materials can provide exposure to authentic input through the instructions for the activities and the spoken and written texts. We can make use of the activities such as interviewing the teachers, doing project in local community, listening to radio, and many more. And in order to facilitate acquisition, the input must be comprehensible or understandable enough to achieve the purpose of responding to it. In other words, the input should vary in style, mode, medium, and purpose, and should be rich in features which are characteristics of authentic discourse in the target language. This principle relates to the first principle of language acquisition, wherein material should encourage the learners to be exposed into authentic activities that represents how a language is typically used in order to acquire the ability to use the language effectively. Principle 8. The learner's attention should be drawn to linguistic features of the input. Many researchers agree that helping learners to pay attention to linguistic features of authentic input can help them eventually acquire some of those features. White in 1990 argues that there are some features of second language that are quite similar to the features of the first language that makes it impossible for the learners to notice. It is important for the learners to be aware of the gap between a particular feature in their interlanguage. It alerts the learners for the instances of the same feature in the future input. Schmidt in 1992 then suggested an approach to help learners note the gap between the features of English, which is through inviting learners to compare their use of, say, indirect speech with the way it is used in a transcript. This principle adheres to the fifth principle of language acquisition. It was said that when learners notice themselves how a particular language is used, it is more likely to develop their language awareness. Thus, it enables learners to pay attention for the similar uses of the features. Materials must let the learners experience a potentially engaging text, respond to it personally, and focus on a particular feature in order to make discovery about it. Principle 9. Material should provide the learners with opportunities to use the target language to achieve communicative purposes. Learners should be given the opportunities to use the language for communication rather than just practice it in situations controlled by the teachers and the materials. Using the language for communication involves attempts to achieve a purpose in a situation in which the content, strategies, and expression of the interaction are determined by the learners. Such attempts can enable the learners to check the effectiveness of their existing hypotheses. Teaching materials should provide opportunities for communicative interaction in a variety of discourse, ranging from planned to unplanned. Interaction can be achieved, for example, information or opinion gap activities, which require learners to communicate with each other and the teacher in order to close the gap. Post-listening and post-reading activities, which require the learners to use information from the text to achieve a communicative purpose. Creative writing and creative speaking activities, such as writing a story or improvising a drama. And lastly, formal instruction, given in the target language either on the language itself or on another subject. This principle adheres to the sixth principle of language acquisition, as it provides opportunities for the learners to use the language to develop the ability to communicate fluently, accurately, appropriately, and effectively. Materials should encourage learners to produce a text which is a development from the one that they have experienced. This allows the learners to respond to an authentic stimulus, thus developing their communicative skills. Principle 10. Materials should take into account that the positive effects of instruction are usually delayed. Studies on the acquisition of language shows that it is a gradual rather than an instantaneous process. Acquisition results from the gradual and dynamic process of internal generalization. Learners cannot be expected to learn a new feature and to be able to use it effectively at the same lesson. Although they may be able to rehearse the feature, to produce it when prompted by the teacher, but it doesn't mean that the learning has already been taken place. Hence, it is important that the learners are not forced into premature production of the instructed features because they will get it wrong, so as that tests of proficiency are not conducted immediately after instruction, as they will indicate failure or illusion to success. To facilitate the gradual process of acquisition, it is important for materials to recycle instruction and to provide frequent and ample exposure to the instructed language features in communicative use. This principle relates to the first principle of language acquisition, imposing that learners need to experience particular language items and features many times in meaningful and comprehensible input to eventually acquire them. Material shall expose the learners to sufficient samples of language in authentic use to provide natural recycling of language items and features, which is beneficial for the learners to acquire. Principle 11. Material should take into account that learners differ in learning styles. Learners have different learning styles. Maybe others want to see the language written down. Others may want to hear the language. And others may prefer to do activities related to physical. Thus, activities in language learning material should be variable and should ideally cater all learning styles. Styles of learning that needs to be catered includes visual, auditory, kinesthetic, studial, where learners like to pay conscious attention to the linguistic features of the language and want to be correct, experiential, where learners like to use the language and are more concerned with communication than with correctness, analytic, where learners prefer to focus on discrete bits of the language and to learn them one by one, global, where learners are happy to respond to whole chunks of language at a time and to pick up from them whatever language they can, dependent, where learners prefer to learn from a teacher and from a book, and lastly, independent, where learners are happy to learn from their own experience of the language and to use autonomous learning strategies. The important point for material developers is that they are aware of and cater for differences of preferred learning styles in their materials and that they do not assume that all learners can benefit from the same approaches. Thus, it is important to consider the learning styles of the learners in crafting the materials. This principle also relates to the first principle of language acquisition, where learners are exposed in a lot of ways where language is used that are relevant to the learner's needs. Materials must contain a variety of spoken and written texts that are likely to be meaningful to the target learners and their needs. Principle 12. Material should take into account that learners differ in affective attitudes. Language learners should have a strong and consistent motivation and also positive feelings towards the target language, their teachers, their fellow classmates, and the materials. However, ideal learners do not exist because in reality, learners have differing attitudes. Material developers must be aware of the inevitable attitudinal differences of the learners. Diversify language instruction as much as possible based upon the variety of cognitive styles and the variety of affective attitudes likely to be found among learners. This can be done by providing choices of different types of texts and activities, including units that discusses the value of learning English, including activities that involves learners in discussing their attitudes and feelings about the course, and being aware of the cultural sensitivities of the learners. This principle adheres to the second and third principle of language acquisition, wherein the affective attitudes of the learners towards the teachers, fellow learners, and materials are being considered. Materials must encourage affective and cognitive engagement by making use of activities that enable learners to think and feel to achieve communicative competence.
Materials should maximize learning potential by encouraging intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional involvement, which stimulates both right and left brain activities.
A narrowly focused series of activities which require very little cognitive processing, examples given are mechanical drills, rule learning, and simple transformation activities, usually leads to shallow and ephemeral learning unless linked to other activities which stimulate mental and affective processing. However, a varied series of activity making, for example, analytic, creative, evaluative, and rehearsal demands on processing capacity can lead to deeper and more durable learning.
In order for this deeper learning to be facilitated, it is very important that the content of the materials should not be trivial or banal and that it stimulates thoughts and feelings of learners. It is also important that the activities are not too simple and that they cannot be too easily achieved without the learners making use of their previous experience and their brains.
The maximization of the brain's learning potential is a fundamental principle of Lozanov's Suggestopedia, in which he enables the learners to receive the information through different cerebral processes and in different states of consciousness so that it is stored in many different parts of the brain, maximizing recall. Suggestopedia does this through engaging the learners in a variety of left and right brain activities in the same lesson. Examples given are reciting a dialogue, dancing to instructions, singing a song, doing a substitution drill, or writing a story.
While not everybody would accept the procedure's Suggestopedia, most researchers seem to agree on the value of maximizing the brain's capacity during language learning, and the best textbooks are ready to contain within each unit variety of different left and right brain activities. Material should provide opportunities for outcome feedback.
Feedback, which is focused first on the effectiveness of the outcome rather than just on the accuracy of the output, can lead to the output becoming a profitable source of input. Or in other words, if the language that the learner produces is evaluated in relation to the purpose for which it is used, that language can become a powerful and informative source of information about language use. Thus, a learner who fails to achieve a particular communicative purpose is more likely to gain from feedback on the effectiveness of their use of language than a learner whose language is corrected without reference to any non-linguistic outcome.
It is very important, therefore, for materials developers to make sure that language production activities have intended outcomes other than just practicing language. In addition, from Tomlinson, materials development should help learners develop cultural awareness, reflect the reality of language use, help learners in ways that are similar to the circumstance in which they will have to use the language, help create readiness to learn, and achieve effective engagement.
Dance!